The massive submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy represented a real danger to the Panama Canal. Lieutenant Commander Stephen L. Johnson faced a critical situation roughly 100 miles off Honu, one of Japan's home islands, when his small-class boat, the Segundo, picked up a large radar contact heading south toward Tokyo. The Pacific theater of World War II had only just ended, and the ceasefire was in its 14th day. The formal surrender documents would not be signed until September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship USS Missouri. As Johnson closed the distance, he realized the contact was an enormous submarine, so vast that in the dim light it could have passed for a surface vessel. He understood it must be Japanese. The Americans had no craft of that magnitude. For the 29-year-old commander, on his first command, this meant confronting possibly the largest and most advanced submarine afloat. With a surface displacement of 5,233 tons, over 3 times that of the Segundo, the Japanese I-400-1, stretched longer than a football field. More troubling than its size was the ship's heavy armament: 8 huge bow torpedo tubes, 3 triple-barrel 25mm anti-aircraft mounts, an extra 25mm gun on the bridge, and a 5.5-inch gun on the aft deck. Though the big sub flew the required black surrender flag, it slipped away into the night as the Segundo closed. The presence and handling of the rising sun flag gave rise to suspicion. Johnson pursued and ultimately slowed the vessel as daylight approached, and the two ships entered a tense standoff. He trained his bow tubes on the Japanese boat and realized the prize before him could boost his career and yield important scientific opportunities. He and his crew had authorization to seize the reluctant Japanese vessel if necessary in the waters near Japan. Much depended on the inexperienced American submarine captain and his resourceful counterpart. Johnson did not know that the Japanese boat belonged to the I-400 squadron, essentially submerged aircraft carriers, or that Commander Tatri Arumi, the pilot of the I-41, had been the designer of those top-secret submarines originally intended to launch surprise strikes against the U.S. mainland. Given his reputation as the father of the I-400 series, years of naval experience, and his steadfast devotion to the Emperor, Arumi would find surrender a bitter humiliation. Lieutenant Samber Nuko Nambu, skipper of the I-41 with combat experience stretching back to Pearl Harbor, was the opponent Johnson now faced. The I-41 was the largest submarine in the world, designed to carry 3 cutting-edge attack aircraft in a hangar atop the hull. The I-400 class was full of technological innovations. Its Aichi M6A1 planes were meant for a possible second Pearl Harbor or another surprise strike, perhaps even against New York or Washington. These subs could make a maximum surface speed of about 19 knots, over 22 mph, stay on patrol for 4 months, twice the endurance of the Segundo, and could circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times without refueling. After the Emperor's proclamation of surrender on August 15th, neither Nambu nor Commander Arumi immediately complied with the order, even though it confirmed that peace had been declared while instructing all submarines to carry out their prearranged missions. One of the strangest developments to emerge from Tokyo arrived. About 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and the architect of Japan's naval strategy, had long ago ordered the creation of the I-400 series. Yamamoto, who had toured the United States and warned that a drawn-out war with America would be disastrous, later died when his plane was shot down by U.S. fighters. After Japan entered the conflict, he believed that submarine-borne aircraft raining bombs on major American cities could sap American morale. He thought sudden, devastating strikes might break the public will and force the United States to seek terms. Although the Japanese already operated submarines carrying float planes for reconnaissance, those boats lacked the numbers and survivability to compel Washington to negotiate. Yamamoto therefore proposed a radically different submarine able to steam some 40,000 nautical miles without refueling, more than 4 times the range of a small-class boat like the Segundo. The I-400 design would carry two attack aircraft capable of roughly 600 miles range at high speed, and the boats would stock about 1,850 tons of fuel and provisions to sustain crews of roughly 147-157 men for 4 months. The hangar had to be at least 100 feet long and robust enough to survive deep-sea pressure and aerial attack when surfaced. At just over 400 feet in length, the I-400s would be about the size of a small cruiser and displace some 6,560 tons, submerged, roughly 3 times the displacement of the largest U.S. submarines, leading observers to describe Yamamoto's request as essentially a small underwater aircraft carrier. He authorized 18 of the huge subs, enough to carry 36 attack planes in total, and by June 1942, the proposal had cleared the normally slow Japanese naval bureaucracy, with construction of the first 5 scheduled to begin in January 1943. Soku became the shorthand for this special class. Designing the carrier fighters demanded a complete rethink. Speed, range, and bomb load had to be balanced to fit inside the hangar on the sub's deck, so folding wings were essential. An aircraft company was contracted to design, test, and build the planes. Engineers removed the floats to improve performance and range, and the recovery plan called for crews to circle, ditch, and be picked up by the submarine. Each aircraft carried a pilot, a bombardier, a radio man navigator, and a tail gunner. Early plans called for a rearward-facing belt-fed 13mm Type 2 gun with about 300 rounds and a fixed-forward 7.7mm machine gun. Nevertheless, critics within the highly bureaucratic Imperial Japanese Navy questioned the program, and after the defeat at Midway in early June 1942, Japan shifted its priorities away from ambitious submarine strikes on the U.S. mainland. After Yamamoto's death in April 1943, a few weeks after his 59th birthday, the senior, more conservative voices in the Japanese leadership regained influence. The total number of planned submarines was cut, but the I-400 class was beefed up. Larger boats were to carry a third attack plane, and the smaller I-13 and I-14 were to get an extra aircraft. Naval commanders understood that Japan's defensive ring had been badly weakened after the loss of Guadalcanal, and the undersea carriers shifted their focus from striking New York or Washington to a plan to cripple the Panama Canal. A successful assault on the canal, they reasoned, would hamper the U.S. war effort in the Pacific and buy Japan time to restructure and strengthen its defenses. On November 8, 1943, the new carrier fighter made its maiden test hop, nicknamed Storm, and the aircraft exceeded expectations for an initial submarine-launched attacker. Japanese planners then gathered scarce intelligence on the heavily defended Panama Canal. Their analysis concluded that wrecking the gate into Gatun Lake would cause a massive deluge toward the Caribbean, destroying downstream locks. Some 40,000 U.S. troops guarded the canal, supported by major fortifications at Colon, Fort Sherman, Toro Point, and Margarita Island. Extensive minefields in the approaches, a 16-inch gun with roughly a 25-mile range, 30 aircraft warning stations, 9 airfields, radar sites, searchlights, and heavy anti-aircraft emplacements. The Japanese devised an attack timed for dawn, when lock gates would be closed and some defenses might be less vigilant, planned for the dry season, so Gatun Lake would refill slowly, and intended to use both bombs and torpedoes. Pilots were originally expected to ditch their planes after the strike, circle, and be recovered by the submarines, rather than to conduct suicide runs. Despite nearly a year of planning, the offensive that formally began in early 1945 ran into problems. The planes were not yet in full production, and several submarines remained unfinished. U.S. naval blockades and a domestic steel shortage forced Japanese naval authorities to cut the I-400 program from the planned 18 boats to 5, plus the 2 smaller I-13 and I-14. But planning continued because Japanese leaders remained convinced that destroying the Panama Canal could disrupt the flow of American troops and material and might even affect Allied demands for unconditional surrender. Through persistence, the Navy completed the I-400 and the I-13 and turned them over late in 1944. I-400 No. 1 entered service in early January 1945, and by mid-March 1945, I-14, the last carrier submarine, was operational. Late in 1944, the carrier aircraft were still being flight tested, and a crippling labor shortage meant many factory workers were schoolgirls aged 12 to 15. Production was further hampered by 2 earthquakes, recurring engine problems, and repeated American air raids, yet work pressed on. As a disturbing aside, Vice Admiral Gaburo Ota, Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff, proposed an alternative use for the I-400s while the Panama Plan was still being finalized. Equipping the carrier planes with biological agents and releasing insect vectors over a populated area on the U.S. West Coast. He consulted Dr. Shiro Ishii, head of Unit 731 and Japan's foremost authority on pathogens, who suggested dispersing plague-infected fleas, a technique tested in China, and mentioned San Francisco, Los Angeles, or San Diego as possible targets. The Army's General Staff rejected the idea in late March on humanitarian grounds. In effect, the very unit that had developed and field-tested biological weapons on prisoners refused to deploy them against U.S. civilians. By the war's end, partly because of relentless American offensives, Japan's submarine force had been decimated. Only about 20 modern submarines, including those of the Soku Squadron, remained at the start of 1945. As the 2 completed I-400 boats began trial launches of their carrier aircraft, more practical problems surfaced. Live training showed it took roughly 45 minutes to surface, ready and launch 3 planes, while operational plans required completing that cycle in under 30 minutes. Those extra quarter hour above water could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for crew and pilots. They also encountered mechanical and logistical setbacks, including shortages of fuel for the aircraft. As mines made operations ever more hazardous, Japanese commanders repeatedly revised their plans and, facing mounting urgency and inexperienced pilots, abandoned a torpedo strike in favor of loading each of the 10 aircraft assigned to the Panama Canal mission with a single 1,160-pound bomb, the largest in the Navy's inventory and comparable to the E explosive that demolished USS Arizona. That decision effectively turned the flyers into suicide attackers. Their low-level runs would crash the planes into the lock gates to ensure the job was done. The pilots accepted the mission in silence, and the flotilla prepared to sail in mid-June. Crews on the larger boats learned to launch the first 2 aircraft in roughly 4 minutes apiece. And after overcoming an initial snag, they got the 3rd airborne in about 20 minutes, trimming the total launch cycle to just under half an hour. An eternity when the subs sat exposed on the surface in enemy-watched waters. At a training area in Nanao Bay, the Saren pilots rehearsed attacks on a full-scale mock-up of the Gotten locks, practicing the planned low, fast runs without floats and with live ordnance strapped to the aircraft. By then, everyone understood the stakes. Testing proved costly. 9 men died in crashes and another was lost in a ground accident, making troubleshooting and refinement painfully difficult. As the last of the Soku boats to enter service and the one with the least experienced crew, the I-14 proved especially hard to bring up to operational speed. With American forces pressing closer and the loss of important assets in March 1945, Japanese planners concluded the canal strike was no longer feasible. Alternative ideas, surprise raids on Los Angeles or San Francisco, were considered but eventually set aside in favor of a plan to strike U.S. carriers at Ulithi, a major American anchorage in the Carolines. The 2 large carrier subs were to make separate approaches, rendezvous near the target, and strike in mid-August. To confirm carrier presence, I-14 and I-13 were to stage through Japanese-held Truk. When I-13 failed to reach Truk, it was presumed lost on August 4th. I-14 arrived and its aircraft reconnoitered Ulithi the following day. Then the crews learned of Hiroshima's destruction, and on August 15th, they heard the Emperor's broadcast urging surrender. Conflicting orders followed. One message directed all submarine captains to continue their missions. Yet hours before a planned strike on August 16th, specific cancellation orders arrived for the undersea carriers. Ultimately, the I-41 and the surviving carrier subs were handed over to American forces. Commander Arumi, the submarine's designer, took his own life aboard I-41 and the crew buried him at sea. Lieutenant Nambu complied with the surrender. The subs flew the black flag, their weapons were stripped, and some aircraft were scuttled before contact with the Americans. Code books, logs, and other sensitive material were weighted and cast overboard. At one point, a torpedo was set adrift and circled back near the big sub before disappearing beneath the waves. When the three subs later steamed into Tokyo Bay, they drew intense scrutiny. Despite the visible catapults, many U.S. observers at first assumed the huge hangars were meant for supply runs to distant garrisons. The Japanese sailors cooperated with American interrogators, and by late September, U.S. teams had taken the boats on trial runs and then moved them to Hawaii for detailed study. After extracting as much intelligence as possible, the U.S. Navy deliberately scuttled all three by early June 1946 to keep them out of Soviet hands. One Siren aircraft did make it to the United States and was later restored at considerable expense, reportedly about $1 million, and has been shown in a museum exhibit. American naval engineers took particular interest in the sub's anechoic coatings, even though the service ultimately set some features aside. The I-400 concept nonetheless anticipated later strategic submarines. Elements of the design surface in post-war programs, most notably the Regulus missile effort roughly a decade later, which carried nuclear warheads in watertight deck housings. So, in short, iterations of Yamamoto's idea helped shape the strategic undersea platform